and welcome to A Girl, a Guy, and a Buffy podcast.
Yes, hello, welcome back. I'm Kate Baldwin.
And I'm Charles Swint, and we are a Buffy podcast, as the title would imply.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and we're talking about one of our favorite shows. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, we are not doing your typical episode by episode review. We've gone a more thematic route, and this first season we're looking at the show through a feminist and gender lens, and each episode we're taking on different topics with that perspective. And so today we are looking at sex and sexuality in the Buffyverse.
Yes.
And what's our question that we're going to be exploring today?
So we have so many questions. So let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. So the question that we have today is, was the sex on Buffy empowering?
Yeah, it's a
Um,
good question. I think first we kind of need to do again some level setting and talk about how sex was portrayed on television, particularly on teen shows, at that time.
I literally thought you were going to say, and I know you weren't, but for some reason, I thought you were going to say, we should establish what is sex.
So maybe we need to go that basic. Um,
We'll let you all determine what you think is sex.
yeah, exactly.
Go from there. I'm not gatekeeping your sexuality.
So yeah, what was sex like on teen shows in the 90s, Charles?
Oh gosh, it was you know what? Teen sex in the 90s was all over the place. Um, it wasn't it wasn't like hot and steamy necessarily.
No.
Um, it was much more chaste. And I mean, we were coming off the heels, like the 90s was a time like we were just coming out of like the HIV crisis was like huge on everybody's mind, and like
Yeah.
everyone was talking about it, and it was such a critical it was such a critical junction in how television and pop culture started to relate to sex and sexuality. And so, songs like Salt and Pepper, like Let's Talk About Sex, like that song was talking about like using protection. And like it was becoming a very big thing about trying to have a conversation about sex using pop culture and media as a way of informing young people about sex. So it wasn't like anything that you would have seen on like Euphoria now, for sure.
Right, right. Yeah, like funny enough, another Michelle Gellar project, Cruel Intentions, was certainly seen as almost too racy and too much for the teen film genre. And now that would probably look like super tame today compared to what teen shows are doing now, particularly on streaming or paid like HBO.
For sure. I mean, Ryan Phillippe's Naked Bottom was definitely like sexual awakening for me.
Understandable.
I was like, thank you. Thank you. I didn't know. And here it is. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I mean, I would say teen sex in the 90s was certainly not very nuanced. It was probably a lot of, particularly for young women, there was a lot of judgment, a lot of shaming. Like
Hmm.
you were, if you were a virgin and decided to have sex, unless you were having it with like somebody you were in a long-term relationship with, and you also didn't like, you had to go back and forth. And not that it isn't a big decision, but like, there was all this sort of cultural norms wrapped up in it, and how we see women and particularly young women and their sexuality.
It was very much the modern day fairy tale and sort of a
Yeah.
grim fairy tale of a scare tactic of keeping young people from having sex, especially on television. I think
Yeah.
but it does seem that like in some shows that the more affluent you were,
Yeah.
the more free you could be with your sexuality. And I think that says a lot too about saying because you have those economic freedoms, you have more access to drugs, alcohol, and possibly other options,
Right.
when you're talking about that stuff. So I think there's a subtle underlying of classism and how we talk about sex and our sexual responsibilities based um on our accessibility of
Yeah.
things,
Yeah, that's a really good
of
point.
resources.
I think the other part of that too is how it was often portrayed between the classes is, more affluent and particularly like incredibly, rich characters. There was a sense of the parents weren't really paying attention. So there was that element too. Like there was more ability to be permissive because you didn't have anybody watching you. You didn't have to be home by a certain time.
Right.
That was sort of the stereotype.
They certainly weren't talking about queer relationships or queer sexual relationships. I mean, it was just enough to have queer characters on television, much less, them having sex with each other, or understanding their own sexual identity. So I think the 90s were trying to be responsible, but I think because of the AIDS crisis, there was so much of a course correct that went, I think, a little bit too far in the other direction of trying to keep people, completely abstinent instead of talking about the actual responsibilities of being a sexually active young person.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a period of transition because, as we said, I think we talked about in our first episode that, focusing on teens and teen culture, particularly in television, was really starting to grow in the 90s and become its own phenomenon, own focus. So I think you were really transitioning during that period between sort of the after school special slash very special episodes that you would have more in the 70s and 80s
Mhm.
to something that was much more, that was a bit more nuanced. They weren't quite there yet compared to what you're seeing nowadays. Partially because, as you said, so many groups were left out. It tended to be, obviously very heteronormative, also tended to be focused often on white characters that were middle class or affluent. So there's a lot of stories being left out that have we've seen more of in the last 20 years. But I definitely think there was developing nuance with shows like My So-Called Life and, like you said, Skins from the UK and Buffy, honestly. One of the things Buffy certainly did was it centered it in the female character, because she was the lead, and then the other female characters as well. It was her choices, her point of view, even though it was, primarily being told, by a male showrunner. I still think you had a lot of there wasn't that sort of we're watching from afar, we're watching it through her perspective. Buffy had her own ability to make those choices. It's interesting that like the way Anya and Cordelia approach sex, I feel is very kind of they're it's looked on positively. Like they're not shamed for being embracing sex, embracing their sexuality. Even Cordelia in high school, like she's not slut shamed. Maybe by like a side character, but none of the main characters, and I certainly don't think the show presents her that way at
Right.
all. So it's interesting that I think that's great. Like there was a lot of, it's along with all the messiness and the complications and a lot of the like maybe unhealthy emotional relationships, for the most part, particularly I think for the female characters, you know, there was a lot of healthy, positive portrayals of sex.
I think so. And I think too, in terms of, even how the show was filmed, and I think we've discussed this before too, how the show was filmed, it didn't over sexualize the women. That was never, never those slow pans up or never like focused on, on their breast or anything like that. It was never filmed in like a creepy way or anything like
Right.
that. And even the sex scenes with Buffy and Spike, which were, I mean, those scenes were a little bit, racy for sure. And
Especially for that time. Now they look
yeah,
tame, but
yeah.
yes,
But Buffy and Spike on the, in the bronze
the
overlooking their
balcony
friends, the
one.
balcony scene is just
Yeah.
like,
And Dead Things for
it's
sure.
so, oh, I feel so many things about that. And I don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, there's just a lot, but so overall, I think it did. it wasn't a show about sex and sexuality, so that was cool, but so they're not really looking at those things um necessarily except in terms of, human development and how we grow up and those things being parts of our lives. So uh, I think in those ways, yes, it was sort of empowering it because it gave us some different ways to look at sex and to look at sexual relationships and to explore what those things, like what are good relationships, what are bad relationships. We get the good relationship with, with Oz and Willow, surrounded by all of these other, like Buffy and Angel and this weird sort of, creature of the night sort of situation happening, and then the shameful relationship with. So we do get to compare and see, well, which one do I actually want? But there could have been more discussions, I think, between the characters about their relationships and their sexual relationships. Um, but also it
Yeah,
wasn't a show about sex, it was a show about vampires. So,
yeah. Well, it was a show about, the supernatural imposed on high school and then growing up as a young adult for sure. But it's funny that you say that about there could be more done. One of the things I really thought about, other than after her night with Parker, where she gabs with Willow and, doesn't get into a lot of details, but they do talk about like,
mhm.
not only the relationship stuff, but the sex stuff. That's really like the only sex conversation. And I felt like as they got older, and granted, they were, there was a lot of emotional um, stuff happening in season 6, a lot of everyone falling apart as they make their way into adulthood. But and Buffy was ashamed of her relationship with sex with Spike, so she certainly wasn't going to talk about sex.
Mhm.
But there was never like a lot of that kind of girl talk, which I
Yeah.
think was missing out. Um, we don't even have like other than like, oh, and then Joyce just after she finds out that Buffy slept with Angel because Angelus tells her, she has the safe sex conversation, but you also don't like see as they get older any healthy conversations about
Mhm.
sex between mother and daughter either.
And I think and ironically enough, or maybe not so much, is the only person who's really talking about straightforwardly about sex is Anya. And
Yes,
and maybe it's because of her, how she's written, which that gets into a whole other thing because her character
right.
keeps changing all the time of like who
Yes,
she's supposed to be. But
that's so true.
the one thing that never really changes is that she's always like, I like sex, I want sex. And oh, and sometimes we go off and we have sex together. And this is what it's like. And she's very pragmatic about it. And she has like zero shame about it. And she's like, yeah, I'll tell you about it. I'm telling you what I like, and I tell you it feels good. And I'm going to tell everybody. Is it appropriate? Not always, especially when Dawn's around. It's not necessarily appropriate, but the fact that she does. One of the funniest things to me, I think it's funny, but also just really telling, is like when Xander gets split apart, when he gets split into two, and
Yeah.
right before they put him back together, Anya's like, can we just keep them apart for a minute? Just because I want to see what that's like. And everyone looks at her weird, and it's like, but it's a fair statement. I mean,
I
I think it's a fair statement for her to make.
I
She
totally
likes
agree.
one, why wouldn't she like two? Let's,
Well, yeah, and one thing I've never really thought about before, but it just kind of came to me as you were talking. We also didn't take into account when Anya was born and in the
hmm
culture she was born into. And then she's lived for 1100 years and seen multiple cultures, been, seen sexual humanity and mores and attitudes toward it like evolve over time. So she certainly has a different perspective about
hmm
sex than, you know, modern day America based in its like puritanical shame about sex.
Right. I
You
mean,
know, that of course, like, why wouldn't she be that way?
yeah, I mean, she's been around the world. She's seen it all. She's lived
Yeah.
through countless revolutions, countless like, you know, the development of humanity. Um, so yeah, and again, but it's about like how her character is written. there are inconsistencies about some of those things. Like her attitudes about sex are one way, but other things it doesn't make any sense. Um,
Yeah, agreed.
yeah,
Agreed.
but
But weirdly, I do think instead of the characters looking at her weird for all the like, or embarrassed for all the things she'll say out loud, particularly as it relates to sex, I don't actually feel like the show is judging her for it. I think the characters are uncomfortable because of how the characters might feel about sex and talking
mm,
about it. But I don't think that's like the show is saying Anya's wrong.
yeah, I don't think so. I think everyone else is like, Anya,
Right.
you're wrong, and these are inappropriate. And,
Yeah.
and she says that a lot. She's like, I'm always being told that the things that I say are weird and
Right.
wildly inappropriate. And I don't understand that. Um, so we're talking about sex and sexuality and Buffy. I mean, it's hard pressed not to talk about Angel.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
we have to, since that was her first time.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, and what that looked like. I mean, talking about, the warning, these sort of warnings of, the dangers of having sex and all of this other stuff. I mean, this is the ultimate warning, like sleep with the guy and he's going to murder everyone in town.
Exactly. I mean, it's bad enough that like there's pressure put on young women about whether or not they do or don't have sex and when and all those kinds of choices. And then you have like this whole other element added on top of it
Right.
that she didn't even know about,
Right.
but
And
like
this,
she takes on that guilt for. So,
yeah. And so what does that say? Like, just because you sleep with a guy and he becomes a jerk afterwards because he got what he wanted, you don't have to carry that weight on you. That's not your fault.
no, it's true. Like take away the supernatural elements. If somebody sleeps with someone and like you said they get what they want and in this case obviously it's male female relationship, but I think that's true of anything. It's not your fault. I mean, if you had, you know, no inclination that they they had that or that's what they were trying to do, they just wanted to get you into bed. I mean, it's so terrible that somebody would feel guilt and shame for it because it's not your fault.
And I mean, when you look at it, Angel is the ultimate narcissist. I mean, he is
Yeah.
completely, I mean, and even as Angelus, he is a little bit of a narcissist. I mean, he's very broody. He's like, it's about me, and it's about, and I think he tries to be sweet, and he is a nice guy, but I think he sort of,
Well, there's definitely a sense of, to me anyway, of stunted growth in Angel. Um, the fact that he spends like 100 years, it says something that he didn't even at any point over that time, like start to try and do good or make changes or, pull himself
but
together.
I mean, it takes Buffy. It takes seeing Buffy for him to, I guess, to start to realize that he needs to do that after 100 years. But it
Yeah.
really shouldn't have taken a 16-year-old girl to like get your moral compass back in place.
Well, yeah, I mean, that says a lot. And that puts an awfully terrible burden on poor Buffy, whether she knows it or not. You can't have like a real partnership when there's sort of that sense of imbalance in it.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. You may look like you're in your 20s or whatever. And you know what, quite frankly, it doesn't matter because still there's always this age imbalance because even if you like go with the conceit that he was in his 20s or whatever when he got turned and so he will always be that age externally, she's still 16. That's still an
Yeah.
inappropriate relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
It's never not okay.
Right.
And we all fell for it though. We all
Oh,
swooned. We
100%.
all bought into it. We were like, yes.
I'm sure there are some fans out there who were like, I knew that from the start. But like, yeah, most of us, I was actually watching a clip today, because I was kind of curious to say if there was any quotes from Joss Whedon about how he felt about the vampires in the universe. He was saying that when he thought of the idea of like, oh, there's this vampire and he's gonna kiss her, and then his, vampire face comes out and everyone's gonna think this is like so stupid and hokey. And he's like, no, they all like loved it and like where it went from there. And I was like, oh, we all bought into it.
Oh, absolutely. But then
I know.
let's talk about Spike.
Oh, we're
Can
gonna
we
skip
talk?
Riley.
Can we please? We could talk about Riley.
I think sex between Buffy and Riley in season 4 is portrayed very positively. It kind of they show her enjoying it. They show like honeymoon phase. So I think that's kind of really refreshing. She's a freshman in college, 18 years old, then 19. Well, I think she's more 19 by the time they first sleep together. So, he's her third partner at this point. Um, I think she's kind of coming into her own. So it's interesting that it's, with Riley and with the human guy. I'm not saying there's not flaws in their relationship,
Right.
100%, but I think as far as sex goes, is certainly in that beginning stage, that season 4, I think probably her healthiest.
So, and I want to clarify when you're talking about partner, you mean her third sexual partner.
Yes, sorry,
And
correct.
that,
Third
yeah,
sexual
okay.
partner. Yes, thank you
With
for clear. So first there was Angel, then obviously she had sex with Parker, which,
Parker, right.
again, she thought was going to be something more, and he was there for the one night stand, which when you think about her relationships in totality, it's really mean for the show to have done that to her back to back.
Hmm.
Probably somewhat realistic, but still mean.
But then it also kind of goes to how she treats Riley and how she
Yeah,
does kind of keep him at arm's length for a lot of it, especially for like the emotional stuff
right.
surrounding it. But then she's found someone who she can kind of, once the secret is revealed and she's like, oh, you're in the initiative and oh, you're the Slayer. Once they kind of get on that same page, and
Right.
then, they start having the physical relationship, which I think for the first time for Buffy, this is like, yes, finally, I can have what feels like safe sex with someone who
Yeah.
feels safe, who's not going to abandon me, but I'm still keeping him at a distance emotionally because I don't think she's ready for the emotional toll that she really has to go through. But
Well, and her trauma, her mechanism for dealing with trauma is to shut herself down. So
right,
that's a lot of it because she hasn't dealt with her trauma, with her, mental health, with all the things that have happened in her life.
right.
Even not related to the supernatural, just going back to like her parents' divorce.
Hmm.
She's never dealt with in a healthy way through therapy, through, actually talking about it, even talking about it just with people in her life.
Right,
And so, yeah, you have that disconnect where she's sort of having this healthy sexual relationship, but another emotionally unhealthy relationship at the same time with the same person.
right. And then that healthy relationship turns into something weird and phantasmagoric. And, then we
Yeah.
get where the wild things are,
But it's funny. I was thinking about this today as I was like preparing for this conversation. And even that is like, as not great as we both think that episode is, it's surprisingly there's a surprising lack of shame about the
That's
sex they
true.
get up to. Now her friends are like, you guys are like, we're sick of the honeymoon phase. Stop like, always wanting to get.
But the initiative does. Those guys rag on him.
That's true.
They make a lot of statements. They make a lot of sly comments at the side of their mouth once they leave the room about them going off to have sex. And it's like, you know what? That's not your place.
The patriarchy uses judgment and shame, particularly towards women and sex, as a way to control. And so that's certainly apropos of what the initiative represents in that season. So messy and complicated, which makes it hard to have, I think feelings about because you have so many different feelings and you're like, oh, should I be feeling this way? Should I not be feeling this way? But I think to me, that's always been the most wonderful part of the show. And that's why I've often liked the later seasons um, more as far as like going back to as great as the high school years were, is because life is so gray and messy and complicated that I love that the show always embraced that. And sex and sexuality is messy and complicated in so many ways. And I certainly think the show never shied away from that fact.
It's very messy and complicated,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're doing it right. Um, But speaking of that being complicated, okay,
So good transition. Moving
um,
on to Spike and Buffy.
let's get into Spike and Buffy. Um, they certainly got into each other, and I mean that, and I mean that in a very like intimate way. I mean, they were
Yeah,
very, I mean, there were times like they were into each other, like
yeah,
when they were together, like
yeah.
that. I mean, it was passion, it was fire, it was not healthy, it
True.
was abusive, it was manipulative, it
Yeah,
was opportunistic, it was all like it was all of those things.
yeah.
Um,
And we're really talking about pre-Soul Spike right now, correct?
yes,
Yeah.
pre-Soul Spike. Because actually once do they even have they don't have sex
No,
after
well,
he gets his soul. They don't
they
have
leave
sex.
it open-ended in one of the final episodes. It's after
Yeah,
she gave the cookie speech to Angel. She
right.
comes back to the basement and they go to black. And the whole point was whatever the fan can imagine, whatever they want. Like
I choose to think that they did not.
that's what I think too. Which to me is sort of the point of where they get to in their relationship in season 7.
Right. That's the healthy part is that
Correct.
they can lean on each other
Right.
emotionally during these difficult times because they understand each other now.
Yeah.
And that the sex is actually the thing that's getting in the way of them having a really good relationship. But
Yeah.
that's just me. But that at that point in time, and later on, it develops again. If you read the comics, goes
Right.
on, and there's a whole lot of other stuff that happens in the comics that's like, ooh,
Yeah.
um, okay,
Yeah.
Buffy, get it. Um,
And when we're talking about the comics here, because I know there are lots of Buffy comics, we're talking about what they consider like a continuation of the seasons. When they call those seasons 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 in the comics. So that's
right.
specific to what we're referencing here if you haven't read any of the comics.
They're interesting and they're very good. But um, back to Spike. Um, what are your thoughts on Spike?
Oh, what are my thoughts? So many thoughts. Thoughts on thoughts on thoughts. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I've been rewatching the series for these conversations because it'd been a while since I had done a whole rewatch. And yeah, I have to somewhat think about what did I think back then, and a lot of what I thought back then has changed so much
Mhm.
now in going back and rewatching it for multiple reasons. Um, so it's interesting. I think back then I saw during particularly later season 5 into their sexual relationship in season 6, more moments of tenderness and almost romantic isn't quite the right word, but maybe tenderness, vulnerability. And now watching it again, I see none of that.
Mhm.
It's just them. If they're not going at each other fighting or verbally, they're going at each other sexually. Like
Mhm.
there were moments before the sex started for sure that were like really beautiful. And I think actually one of the last times or one of the only times something happens that way is ironically in Dead Things, which is certainly one could argue one of the most intense moments in their sexual relationship or
Mhm.
in their relationship in general because of what she does to him in the alley, the way she physically takes out her emotions on him in the alley. And um
And also the fact that she allows her to.
yeah, well, what I was going to say is in the beginning of that episode when they're having sex and then they cut to them under the rugs in his
Mhm.
crypt, they actually have this like kind of sweet, funny, charming conversation. He jokes about, having eaten a decorator and, such. And then all of a sudden he like interrupts it and he's like, "What's going on?" And I was like,
Right.
"Why'd you interrupt it?
Right.
Like you were like bonding over like in a really actually kind of good way." So, but that was sort of the exception to the rule. I had more memory of like more of those moments. And at least going back and rewatching it now, I'm like, I don't see any of that. It was purely like a destructive physical relationship on all levels. It
Mhm.
like verbally, sexually, and then physically in the sense of like fighting.
Yeah, and I think too, also there is this manipulation and this sort of mind game that goes along with it. And I think and I think this is because of the lack of the soul situation happen. Yes, he's got a chip, so he can't hurt people. But then, they change that rule when she comes back, because I think they needed a reason for them to be able to like fight each other, to build up this tension between each
Yes.
other. And I think that's the only reason why they sort of give her this mystical sunburn or whatever that, you know,
Well, and it basically weirdly equalizes them. They're both equal levels of strength now. Like she can he can now go after her as much as she goes after him.
right.
Like I think it would 100% change the relationship
Hmm.
if any of that had happened and he could not physically harm her.
Right. And I mean, and the fact, and too, like, and knowing that, and the fact when she does like beat him up in the alley and she's like punching like
Yeah.
he could have stopped her,
Yeah.
but he chose to just let her keep, you know,
Right.
take it. Um, but I think like there are these moments where, there's like right after she comes back, you know,
Yes.
like they have those moments where she tells them that she's been in heaven and they're sitting on there. So she's starting to open up to him. So
Yeah.
I think those moments of vulnerability happened in the early times. And I think that sort of feeling sort of carried over
Right.
throughout it. But then when they start having sex, you really see him sort of almost using that
Yeah.
as his way in and like isolating her. And again, this is kind of what this is what abusers, not kind of what, this is what abusers do is that they isolate people from their friends. They take what they know and they sort of keep you in this thing. And so what it is it does become an abusive relationship. It is sort of
He's definitely emotionally
but
manipulating
there's
her.
definitely manipulating.
Yeah.
He's manipulating her and he's
He's certainly
goading
taking
her.
advantage of her current mindset.
Yes. So whether you want to call that, assault or something like that, that's for, I think, a therapist to really sort of to nail out. But I think it's
Yeah.
definitely,
It's certainly an equally toxic relationship on both sides.
right.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, I think with Spike, because he has so much heart and he was such a good human being,
Mm,
as a vampire, if he had had a different group he was with, or a different sire who wasn't about the chaos and so much evilness as Angelus and Darla are, and
mm,
then didn't have, the insanity that Drusilla is. And obviously, we get the implication, that violence is very much a part of their sexual relationship because when Spike wants Willow to do the spell to bring Drusilla back, he just ends up giving up and says, I'm just going to go back and basically torture her into loving me again.
right.
So
Yeah.
as a vampire, he's never been taught healthy, sex, healthy relationships. He's only had messed up relationships.
Right.
And then he uses harmony for sex, has no
Right.
emotional feeling for her. So from that perspective, it, he has no he never had that experience. He had nothing to draw from, but all
Right.
those, he doesn't see them as negative, but they really are.
But that begs the question too, can a vampire have a healthy sexual relationship? Are vampires even able to have healthy sexual relationships, soul or no soul? I mean,
Yeah, I think within the way they set up the context of the souls, which, obviously was set up like for a specific storyline that they didn't really universe build a true theory about it. It just sort of developed from there. And so it was held up as the be all end all, certainly with vampires. Um, that, yeah, I would agree that the way the show sets it up, that Spike can never truly love anyone without a soul, that there's always going to be a selfishness
mhm,
at the bare minimum to how he feels.
right. Um, and there are other, and we're talking primarily about Buffy's relationships and her sexual relationships, but there are
Right.
other relationships that happened that were good, bad, and indifferent. Um, there are, of course, lists out there and all of that stuff. I actually saw there's a couple of lists that I saw that like ranked the relationships of all of the other ones, and it was like, five best relationships. And it started going down. And as I was scrolling, I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And it was like Riley and Buffy and Parker, and it named all the, and then it was like Spike and Angel, and it was like, and I was at like number three or whatever,
Hmm.
and got to like two, and I was like, but wait, who's number one? Like, who's the best relationship? And then I like scrolled down, and it was like Oz and Willow, and I was like, of course, yes, Oz and Willow have like one of the best relationships. Although I would say that, like, I think they probably had one of the better relationships, but I mean, Willow and Tara also had a really lovely relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
certainly think in the context of sex and sexuality and first time on the show,
mhm.
um, Willow definitely is probably the best example, and I think
Mhm.
the most healthy
Yes.
for sure.
Yeah.
Her that that was a real partnership with her and Oz. He was respectful of her,
Hmm.
even though she felt like she was ready. He recognized that she at first was just trying to have sex with him because he was already experienced. And he's like, that's not the reason for us
Right.
to have sex, which I think is like unbelievably beautiful and, shows his maturity and his respect for her, which is what I loved about their relationship. And yeah, I think that is definitely one of the healthiest. And I think, relationships are going to have ups and downs. So obviously they did as well. And she and Tara did. But I think overall, her and Tara also had probably the healthiest relationship,
Yeah.
before the really bad magic addiction metaphor
Yeah.
was used. I mean, I'm not saying I love the Willow storyline as far as like that is believable to me that she would get out of control. The fact that they turned it into this like cliche addiction storyline
Yeah.
kind of is, took away from what was developing into like a fascinating character journey for Willow.
Right. Sort of undercutting it a little bit.
Yeah.
And then, and when you look at Xander and his relation, I mean, his relationship with Cordelia was kind of suspect too, because like it started
Yeah.
off, hiding in closets and, and
Yeah.
this very sneaky and shameful, it's a lot of sneaky, shamey sort of making out and sex. And I don't want my friends to know about you and
Yeah.
you're not worth me and all that stuff, which I also think is really interesting that behavior, like that's how he was treated. And it's kind of how he treats Anya later,
Yeah.
like, and it's like these patterns of behavior, how they were treated is how they treat the next person. And I think, I mean, that's what we do as people, is that we internalize all that trauma and then we like turn it around on other people.
Yeah. And I think also with Xander too, all of his relationships started with sex. Like he did
Yes.
not start just dating someone in a normal, healthy way.
Hmm.
It was making out with Cordelia, and then they decided to try for like a real relationship. Um, but I think they never really got over the the differences in their social status within the high school context. And then, well, and obviously he cheats on her, so that's a big
Right. Right.
that's a big issue. But I think that also shows his immaturity because
Sure.
like for so long he ignored Willow and she had a crush on him, and then he suddenly can't have her. So of course that's what he wants.
Right.
That certainly shows his immaturity as a young man. And then you have obviously his first time with Faith is just
Right.
her using him.
Hmm.
Not that I think he was expecting some sort of relationship, but and then obviously it turns dark
But he
when
does have a special connection with her.
saying, well, about Faith. So first time she's using him, and then the second time when he goes to uh play on their supposed connection, she almost chokes him to death.
Right.
And then with Anya, it starts as sex, and she approaches him and is like, I'm in this human body now. I miss sex. Let's have sex. And then she takes it to be more. Now she suddenly wants a relationship,
Hmm.
and he's not really expecting that. Certainly in the way Anya approaches it, which to her is very like kind of methodical,
Right. Well, she's
like
like, well, this is
not
what
the way he's
happens.
used to. Yeah, exactly. And so they develop in this they kind of don't start from like the right foundation. So I think that's why they fall apart. And then of course, Xander has a lot of um issues relating to his home life, and that's why he
Right.
freaks out when on his wedding day. But yeah, it's interesting.
So, okay, did you take that quiz?
I did. I kind of forced the answer because it was kind of obvious, like what to say.
Did you forced it to a Spike answer, didn't you?
I did, not necessarily because that's. I was just. It was just more like, I really, if I'm gonna choose, just because of where they end up in season 7 after the soul, to me is always like the more interesting. So I'm like, I'm gonna choose Spike for her.
There's a quiz that we found online that asks you, it's asks you questions and then it will tell you which Buffy boyfriend you would end up with based on your
Yeah.
answers. I also ended up with Spike, but I tried to answer mine very honestly. So I don't know what that says about me.
I did too, but I just thought like,
I
I
mean,
mean,
they
some
were
of them.
very leading for
Well,
sure.
yeah, that was the thing. The like choices were so obvious that we were like, oh, if I choose this one, it's going to be Angel. If I choose this one, it's going to be Spike, and if I choose this one, it's going to be Riley. I was like, they needed to mix it up a little.
But yeah,
I,
I think the best relationship that Buffy had was the one just when she was by herself, when it was just her and her choosing herself
yeah,
over everything else is really, I mean, that's the message right there. And I think that's the thing, that's the big takeaway is that no matter what kind of relationship you're in, whether it's a good one, whether it's a bad one, or whether it's toxic, or even if it's if it's like the love of your life, like at some point you still have to continue to choose yourself every day.
yeah. Well, when you say that, thinking about how she ended things with Spike, I think that was probably an incredibly empowering moment because she did it not only for herself but for him. I think she also recognized like he deserved better. She might not like him very much in that moment. But not only did she not want to be using him, but he shouldn't let himself be used that way.
Right.
You know. No, like everything else in Buffy, sex and sexuality is messy, complicated, often painful. But, it certainly makes for interesting storytelling. A lot has changed since those days too. I mean, storytelling and on sex and sexuality and particularly in related to teen stories has grown and developed so much. But I think Buffy definitely like so many aspects to television and teen shows set the baseline for it.
While these and I'm a firm believer that I do believe that you can use um, television and media and things like that and as a way to start conversations about these things. And so while these things are happening and while they're not great, I think they're great tools to start talking about toxic relationships and things like that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to turn this into like a very special episode of I Got a Girl and Buffy podcast, but if anyone out there is like dealing with issues, there are resources available. There is help
Yeah.
out there. We can put some links to resources and things like that in our show notes. And we're going to talk more um, in depth. This is kind of leading into our season finale
Yes.
two-parter here that we've got coming up. And so it's gonna get it's gonna get crazy, y'all. We're gonna we're gonna go into it.
Get a
We're
little
gonna
more intense.
we're gonna we're confronting the big bad, the biggest and baddest of all of the things.
Yes.
Um, when it comes to the ideas of feminism and gender and stuff in the Buffy verse. And so it's gonna be a long one, but it's gonna be
Hopefully a good one.
yeah, a good one. So thank you all so much for joining us this week.
Yes, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. We definitely want to hear your thoughts. If you want to send us an email with your thoughts, questions, concerns, you can email us at abuffypodcast@gmail.com.
We're on Facebook and Instagram at a Buffy podcast. And if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe and download our podcast. We would thoroughly love it. And make sure to leave us a review and send us some stars and some love.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.